Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. Back with another Big East team preview. The St. John's Red Storm coming off their best finish in quite some time. I mean, last year they hadn't been ranked for years. They were 31-5, 18-2 in the Big East. Led by RJ Lewis and several other guys. Bit of a different looking roster now with a bunch of guys coming in through the portal, and Zuby Ejiofor remaining. But Rick Pitino still there. But before we dive in too much to their offense and defense, if you guys are enjoying the content, please go ahead and like and subscribe. We do appreciate all the support. But diving in on the offensive side, obviously this year we're going to talk weaknesses here in a minute, but they don't have a point guard like they did last year, right? And so, what strengths do we see in this St. John's offense?
Yeah, main strengths for me are offensive rebounding, transition offense. It feels like it's going to be a much different style of roster, but I think some of the strengths of or characteristics are going to remain the same. I don't think we see a 96 percentile transition frequency like last year's team, but when you have Ian Jackson as your lead guard and he projects to be the point guard, I expect this team to run early and often. And Jackson is a fantastic rim scorer for a guard, and he's very difficult to stop when he's in space. When you pair Jackson with rim runners and Zuby Ejiofor and Dylan Mitchell, and I think you're going to have a really fun transition attack. And you have a guy like Bryce Hopkins as well, who's another threat with the ball in his hands. He can grab a rebound and go in transition. And then you'll have guys like Hosea Sellers and Josan Sanin running their lanes on the wings in transition, which I think creates a very balanced attack when they're getting out in transition. Then on the offensive glass, I mean, Zuby Ejiofor is a one-man wrecking crew on the offensive glass, and he was a key reason that the Johnnies were so good in this area last year. They were 8th nationally in offensive rebound rate. I know they had some help from the wings, but I do think they get that again this season with a guy like Dylan Mitchell, who has a career 8.3% offensive rebound rate. Bryce Hopkins as well as a 7% offensive rebound rate guy. There's not a ton of help anywhere else, but I mean, Zuby Ejiofor staying on the floor so much is going to be another really key factor. He played 78.3% of the team's minutes last year. He proved last year that he can stay on the floor for consistent minutes, staying out of foul trouble, and I think he's going to be able to do that again. And I think this team's also an improved shooting team. I think it's not really that hard to do. I mean, Pitino, I think he was kind of sick of watching the poor spacing and made it an emphasis in this year's portal cycle. They shot at 30% last year, which was 340th nationally. It was a problem for us going into last season, but they were able to mask it with their elite defense and guard creation. And, the lack of spacing really hurt that offense, though, in general. And they also, they were 175th in 2-point field goal percentage, like as a result of the poor spacing. So it actually hurt them in both areas last year. But, when you add Ian Jackson, who shot at 40% on 4.2 attempts per game, Hosea Sellers, who shot at 40% on 4.2 attempts per game, and Josan Sanin, who shot at 37% on 4.5 attempts per game, it's really going to help open up the lanes, open up Zuby Ejiofor and Mitchell at the rim. Like you mentioned at the top, there's no point guard, and we're not really sure how this all comes together. But I do think the roster is much better from having more balance on the offensive end.
Yeah, not a ton to add. I'll just re-emphasize some points here. This unit will obviously be extremely effective on the offensive glass, just like they were last year. They will be again. Ejiofor kind of leading that charge, but a guy like Dylan Mitchell with his athleticism and length being able to, I think not only grab rebounds himself, but tip balls and, just create chances for second chances. I think he's really good in that area as an athlete. And then Bryce Hopkins, right? He's been dealing with injuries now for the last 2 seasons, but when he's been on the floor, right, he's averaged pretty close to 9 rebounds a game. He's had a strong offensive rebound rate, like 9% or so. So whatever in close to 10%. And then, like you said, the shooting is much better. You got those three guards all coming in that, while none of them are true point guards, they all can shoot it, which should greatly benefit this offense, right? You're going to have three guys that can shoot 37 to 40%, like you said. I think it's going to be extremely beneficial. And then the transition game, I think like the two guys that stand out to me in transition for this team, and actually I'll even throw in a third, Ian Jackson and Dylan Mitchell kind of being the two guys that I have my eye on as like true can really get up and down the floor, and with this defense should be able to have opportunities to get out and run. I think those are two guys. Dylan Mitchell can really fly, and I think beat a lot of four men down the floor if they're ever in a situation where he's playing like some small ball five. He's going to beat a lot of big men down the floor as a lob threat. So I think he can be really impactful, as a defender. We'll talk about that later. And then running the floor. And then Ian Jackson, his ability to really just push the pace up the court. And then I'll throw another guy in there, and Isaiah Sellers, who can really shoot it, right? As that guy that, Dylan Mitchell's running the lane, but then you've got Isaiah Sellers, flooding the outsides, flooding the corners. And, Ian Jackson now has options, right? Sandin has options where, you can throw a lob, you can get to the rim yourself, you can kick out to, either of the other two guards that are running the floor with you for kick out threes. And, to clean it all up, you've got Hopkins, Ejiofor, Dylan Mitchell to rebound that. So I think it's a really strong, more balanced attack. Like last year, we saw a guy like Kadari Richmond, who really good player, but primarily like lived in the mid range, loved his tough shots. Got more to the foul line than anything. Now I think they have more guys that can knock down the three ball. And then, if they don't, they've still got a strong offensive rebounding attack.
Yeah. And then just a point about Kadari Richmond, like he completely forgot how to shoot free throws last year. He was like an 80% free throw shooter the year before he got to St. John's, and he shot at like 50% last year. I don't really know. He just kind of completely lost his touch and feel at the free throw line. So I think they're going to be better in that aspect too. Like they'll be able to get to the line at a decent clip, but I think they're going to be able to capitalize more with the backcourt group that they have now.
Yeah, for sure. So weaknesses of this offensive group, obviously, like the guard creation is a little bit uncertain, right? I remember last year in particular, like Ian Jackson, who is probably slated to play a lot on ball here for St. John's. You remember him at UNC, and a lot of times, right, he's just kind of looking for his own shot. Right, his assist rate was 7%. Even in situations where he would kind of like have a perceived mismatch, right? He'd end up like taking some tough shot versus like really attacking that and creating something maybe not for himself, but for someone else. So I think that's where his game needs to grow to. And based on what we've seen up to this point, that is kind of a concern of mine. I just don't really know where the offensive creation is going to come from. You've got like Sandin, who is another like 7% assist guy. Just not really a fan of the on-ball creation all that much.
Yeah, they might be able to do it by committee. I think that there's a lot of guys on this roster that can get their own shot. Like a guy like Jackson, Sellers can create his mid-range look and a little bit from three. Bryce Hopkins, we haven't seen in a while, but I think he's able to potentially be like a wing or post hub for this offense. But there's no certain number one option from a playmaking perspective, and that's kind of been the talk with this team all offseason. Is this team has no point guard? Like, how are they going to execute in the half court? Which is a very fair point, and I think it leads to some turnovers if it's like more of a mucked up half court offense again. And I don't believe any of the guard options to be able to generate efficient offense for others. But like I said, like I think the front court can kind of help. Dylan Darling is the closest thing to a point guard on this roster, but I'm pretty low on his creation skills translating. Just some numbers from his past years. He was at Idaho State, averaged 20 points per game, 6 assists, shot at 44% and from the field and 36% from three. But here's just some past numbers from before he got to Idaho State. At Wazoo as a freshman, 29.4% effective field goal percentage and a 28.4% turnover rate. Yeah, like I think players are allowed to develop and get a little bit better, but I think that's really alarming when it comes to his game translating back up, particularly to the Big East. And he had worse numbers, or not worse numbers the year after, but very similar numbers. And another concern I have with this team is I think the front court's inability to shoot the ball, or it's a real uncertainty, at least at this point in time, which I think is going to clog some driving lanes for Jackson and the other guys on this roster, which in turn I think will lead to people complaining about the lack of a true point guard. Like Zubi Ejiofor is a willing shooter, but shot at 10 for 45 from three. Dylan Mitchell was 10 for 34. And Bryce Hopkins is 30% for his career on low volume. These three guys are probably not going to be able to play with each other all that much. Even though they're probably, they are the three most, or the three best front court players on this roster, but they're going to have to stagger the minutes if these guys aren't able to space the floor, because Ian Jackson is a guy that needs floor spacing to, use his rim scoring mentality and to be able to, get downhill consistently. If these guys aren't able to space the floor, it's going to create for a very similar dynamic on the offensive end.
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually something else I've thought about is like the guards. Yes, they can get their own shot, but how do we feel about them as like off the dribble 3-point shooters, right? If they're not generating 3-point shots for somebody else or generating shots for somebody else, right? Like, how are they off the dribble from three? Those numbers aren't like fantastic. Granted, it's not a ton of volume in that area because a lot of them weren't asked to be like primary ball handlers and creators last year. But I think that is like a little bit of a concern. I do worry a little bit about this team becoming like too ISO reliant, maybe. With no creator, I think naturally, like you're just going to see guys like end up having poor shot diets at times, particularly against good defensive teams. So I think that's a concern. And then to your point about the floor spacing in the front court, like a guy like Bryce Hopkins used to be a much better shooter, actually. It seemed like since he got injured, right, in 2023, he took 77 threes, like made almost a three a game, 36%. Since then, he's 14 for 63, and that's last year going 4 for 10. So very low volume in 3 games. So, I mean, if he can give them actually 4 for 10 in 3 games, like, and continue to repeat that, like they'd be over the moon about that. But, based on just kind of like the bigger sample size the year before of 10 for 53 in 14 games, like that's not going to cut it. And so it's definitely a concern. And obviously like Dylan Mitchell, being a Texas fan myself, like he never made a three at Texas. He didn't make one in 2 years. Right. Like that's,
did he make a free throw there?
Yeah,
he made it look very tough at Cincinnati last year.
Yeah, I know. And oddly enough, like last year was his best free throw shooting year of his career at 66%. So I don't know. It's definitely a concern. But there is a lot of talent on this offense, as we discussed, in the strengths as well. So there are concerns, of course, like with any team, but there are strengths as well.
For sure. And at the end of the day, I think their talent's going to win out, and it's going to allow them to be fine on the national scale. But there are some concerns, and it goes deeper than just the lack of a point guard.
Right. Yeah. Now on the defensive end, right, what do you see for strengths? This is a team that last year was a top unit. Their ability to kind of switch stuff, particularly like there's that viral clip. I know we talked about it back in the spring of like Zuby Ejiofor, locking down out on the perimeter, right? I think this is a unit again that's going to be able to force turnovers and get out in transition, where we talked about on the offensive side. That's going to be a strength of theirs, due to their ability to switch and be physical and just make plays, I guess, right? I think this should be another strong unit.
Yeah, I mean, Zuby Ejiofor is awesome. I mean, I think he was the final piece to put together the second best defense in the entire country, and on an adjusted defensive perspective per Torvik. And that's the main strength of this roster is just their front court versatility. Ejiofor and Dylan Mitchell is an unbelievable 1-2 punch up front. They both possess rim protection abilities, and they're great in space. St. John's, they turned into a very heavy switching defense last year, like you mentioned, and Ejiofor was just fine. Like, I mean, that clip that we're talking about is a real example, is probably the best example that you can find out there. And Dylan Mitchell fits this style perfectly as well. He can slide right into that Aaron Scott, RJ Lewis role, maybe even be a little bit better, because he's really good on the glass as well. He has a 20.3% career defensive rebound rate, 2.6% block rate, and a 2.3% steal rate. Big time all ball defender, and just another guy that can defend every position on the floor. Hopkins is a solid defender who can play the 3 or the 4. But I mean, we have mentioned that I don't know if all three of these guys could play together if Hopkins isn't able to space it like he did a few years back. So, but from a defensive perspective, I think they would be fine if they all played together. And I think Ruben Prey, coming off the bench, he saw some spot minutes last year. I think he's a solid bench piece, particularly on the defensive side. The 2-point defense is in a good spot, as always, with Pitino teams. Maybe not as good as last year. They finished 13th nationally, but it's still great with the Ejiofor Mitchell duo. And just a few notes on past Pitino defenses. Since 2008, Pitino defenses have finished outside the top 75 in 2-point field goal percentage defense just one time, and that was in 2010. He's only finished outside the top 100 in defensive efficiency twice. And from 2008 to 2017 at Louisville, I think I texted this to you a couple of weeks ago. Pitino had 9 top 10 defenses in 10 seasons, including 6 defenses in the top 3. And he finished second nationally last year as well, as I mentioned. So he clearly still has his fastball on the side of the floor.
Yeah, no doubt. I think like it's just something about the way he coaches that gets his guys to kind of elevate their game on the defensive end in particular. He just gets them, for whatever reason, to buy in, and is kind of, obviously he's 75 years old. He's shown a long track record of being able to do that, and I don't really expect anything different here. Obviously it's like a new backcourt group, which like I wouldn't say I'm like concerned, but it is like there is some, I guess, some potential concern in this backcourt group on the defensive end. Just like Ian Jackson last year, like wasn't like a fantastic defender at UNC. Sannon isn't fantastic. I think they're all like more than capable, and they all have like the talent and traits to be, very, very effective defenders and fit into this scheme well and have the size and switchability that you want in a Pitino defense. But like the eye test and the numbers themselves that they put up, like they're hovering around, either 1% or less than 1% in both block and steal rate. They're going to need to do more than that in a St. John's defensive scheme. And then my other concern is really with Bryce Hopkins, and it's more just kind of like projecting, coming off basically 2 years of not playing, 16 games over the last 2 seasons, knee injuries, right? It's a concern, just in his ability to be as lateral laterally sound, and switch as well as you need to in a Rick Pitino defense that, like you said, really wanted to uh, move into more of a switching scheme last year, and they were able to do that at a very high level. So I have a little bit of concern in like Hopkins' ability to do that right away.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with all those points there. Yeah, I'm particularly concerned about the guard group, honestly, and I have a couple notes to back that up when we get the weaknesses.
Yeah. So what, I guess like moving into your weaknesses, what do you see? You mentioned the guard group.
Yeah.
You know, what are your issues with their guard group?
Yeah, you mentioned Jackson like not being our particularly great defender. I mean, he had a 0.4 defensive box plus minus at UNC. That was the worst in the rotation. Then you have another guy who's in the projected lineup in Osiah Sellers, who was a negative 0.3 in defensive box plus minus at Stanford. That was the worst in Stanford's rotation. And then Josan Sannon, who projects to be a major factor on the wing, he had a negative 0.2 defensive box plus minus at Arizona State. And that was also the worst in Arizona State's rotation. So you're bringing in, I think, personally, three pretty overrated wing defenders. On the surface, they're athletic, they have some switchability, and you have Rick Pitino, who can obviously elevate defenses, and there's going to be somewhat of a motivation factor, and you're going to have to defend for a Pitino team if you want to play consistent minutes. But maybe these guys just aren't all that great of perimeter defenders, which could lead to a much worse defensive team than we've seen in the past, particularly last season. And I think depth is another concern, particularly in the guard group. Dylan Darling is not a good defender, and there's not really any other guys down the roster that you're really going to trust, or Pitino's really not going to play all that much. So with the projected guard rotation, and those guys are probably all going to play at least 25 to 27 minutes, it's just not a very talented guard group.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think like that leads me to my next point, really, that I do like, while I do expect this defense to still be impactful because of the back line, I do think that like this defense takes a sizable step backwards in terms of like where they finish in like adjusted defensive efficiency. Where'd they finish last year? You said 13th. Was that?
In efficiency, they finished second.
Okay.
Yeah.
And right now Torvik has them at 10th. I don't know if I see that. And maybe like the back end can mask some of it, and maybe Pitino can get these guys to elevate their play as like rangier athletic guys who I think can be capable of more. But I would expect them to, like, not that they're going to be a bad unit at all. Like, that's not, especially in this league, I think it's going to be pretty hard to be a bad unit with some of the bad offensive teams in this league. So I still think they're going to be a good defensive team, but I think it's more in like the realm of possibilities that they're in like the 30 range, maybe, just with that guard group.
Yeah, and if they're in the 30 range, they're not a national title contender like a lot of people think they are. But I will say, like, I'd rather have the guard group be a concern than the front court group. This front court group is going to create a very stable floor for Pitino, and like Ejiofor and Mitchell are fantastic, and they have some depth to go along with it. But the fact that Ejiofor is so reliable and was reliable last season, I think it's going to create for a stable defense. It's a top 3 unit in this league, but Pitino teams are built off of having elite defenses, and if you want to have that championship ceiling, I think you need to be a top 10 unit. And this guard group it doesn't really cut it for me. On the surface, they have the intangibles, or maybe not the intangibles, the athleticism, and not even lateral quickness, because the guys like Sellers and Sannon, like I dove into their defense pretty deep because I saw their defensive box plus minus numbers were the worst in the rotation. I'm like, were they really that bad of defenders? And with Sannon, it was pretty ugly. opens his hips too early and just is never really seemed to be in the correct spots defensively. And maybe Pitino's going to help, solve those issues. But ultimately, if you don't have the will to defend or the knack to defend on the ball, it's something that's, very hard to teach in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and for like with Sannon, for example, right? I mean, when he's played a certain way for so long, right? I know last year was just his freshman year of college, right? But he's 19 years old. You've played a certain way of basketball for so long. Like a lot of those habits don't just change overnight, right? It's like if you're trying to change your jump shot, it doesn't automatically like, oh, you shoot, you fix your form and you fix it that day, right? I mean, it's a long process of learning new mechanics and techniques and building on that. So maybe like for Sannon in particular, maybe it's not this year because maybe he just has never really been like properly taught defense. I don't know really his background, right? And it just like last year was maybe a trying year at Arizona State because he just had bad habits. And so now Pitino maybe can try to get those out of him. It's hard to say, but this should still be a strong unit. So anyway, moving ahead, MVP, X factor for this team. What do you think, Cody?
My MVP, I went with Zuby Ejiofor. I just think he has the highest floor on this roster. I know there's some more talented offensive pieces like Ian Jackson or Bryce Hopkins, but I think what Ejiofor is going to provide on both ends, the responsibility he's going to have, particularly on the defensive end, I think is going to be too important to not make him the MVP. To be honest, X Factor, I couldn't really decide. So I went with all of Ian Jackson, Bryce Hopkins, and Zuby Ejiofor because I think they're all important in their own ways. Ian Jackson, learning how to play point guard, learning how to initiate for others is going to be an extremely important trait. Bryce Hopkins' shooting ability is probably the biggest swing piece for this entire team next season, particularly for how good this offense can be from a ceiling perspective. If he can shoot at 35% on decent volume, I'm not going to have that many issues with this offense, and it's going to help. It's going to help the defense as well because they can play a little bit bigger with the Hopkins, Mitchell, and Ejiofor lineups in the front court. And then, like I mentioned, I think Zuby Ejiofor is going to be too important on the offensive glass and as a rim protector to not make him an X factor as well. Ultimately, if I had to pick one, I would say it's Bryce Hopkins with his shooting, with the shooting swing skill, but I couldn't really decide because I think there's so many important players here.
Yeah. I went MVP Zuby Ejiofor as well. I think his impact, we've touched on it enough, but his impact on both ends of the floor is going to be too great, both on the glass and just in general, right? His switchability, his ability to impact the offense. I think it's too great. And then X factor, I did pick a guy. I went Ian Jackson. Obviously last year, 5-star guy. Now coming up here to St. John's, coming back home, and he's going to be having the ball in his hands quite a bit, right? For a team that doesn't have a point guard, he might be like the de facto point guard, and we're gonna see, right, like what he can create. Last year we saw a lot of him like trying to create opportunities for himself. I don't know if he's got that in his bag to create for others, but we're going to find out. And I think his ability to do that and really push the tempo and transition as like a primary guard and decision maker is going to be very important to the ceiling of this St. John's team. So ultimately I went there. I think also of those guards on the defensive end, he has probably the most potential and upside to be more impactful. And so I think he's going to be very important to this team without a doubt. But ceiling, floor, Cody, where do you see this team? And then bold prediction.
Yeah, my ceiling is top of the Big East. I think there's only two options here. It's either them or UConn. And then I believe they can be a 3 or 4 seed at their peak. I don't think they're elite enough on either end of the floor to be in that 1 or 2 seed range like a lot of people have them. A lot of people have this team as a top 5 team in the country, and I I don't see it. There's one particular individual that has them at number 3 and says that they're the most talented roster in the country, which I can't quite get there with that, but I do see the vision. And like, yeah, obviously there's a lot of names on this roster that have been very productive players in their college career, but the fit just needs to, I wish it was a little bit better, because I do really like this program and I love Rick Pitino, but I don't see the ceiling as them being a 1 seed or making it to a Final Four. The floor, I would say 3rd. I think if I'm wrong about Creighton, I think Creighton could be 2nd. And then besides that, there's not really anyone else that can really overtake St. John's for them to fall to 4th. So I would say 3rd in the Big East, and maybe an 8-9 game, maybe a 10 seed if everything goes wrong. Like, we have a decent amount of concerns with this team, national scale. Ultimately, they'll be fine from night to night. But yeah, I do think the 8 to 10 seed range is is definitely an outcome. I don't think it's their most likely outcome. I think they land somewhere in the middle in that 5 or 6 seed range. And bold prediction, actually, come back to me on bold prediction. I'll let you go. Ceiling floor.
Yeah. Ceiling floor, I think, like I said with UConn, 1st or 2nd in the Big East, 1st being the ceiling, floor being 2nd. And then again, I don't really see this as a Final Four team. I could see them making the 2nd weekend in the tournament at their ceiling, and then floor. I think they could be kind of like a middle seed there, 7, 8, 9, and lose in the first round, right? I think the defense, the guard group could hinder them from reaching their ceiling. So that's how I feel about them. And then bold prediction. I said they finish top 10 in turnovers per game on offense in the Power 5.
Yeah, I think that's a decent prediction, honestly. Like we mentioned, if the middle of the floor isn't open, I think these guys, particularly in Jackson, might try to force their way into the lane, and that could create for a ton of turnovers and runouts for the other team. My bold prediction, I think if Ian Jackson has enough on-ball usage and turns himself into a true 3-level scorer, because I do see the vision for him, particularly at the rim. He's unbelievable for a 6'4" guard, and he's shown the ability to knock it down off the bounce from 3. I think if he showcases his game enough, I think he can easily be a lottery pick. So I think that will probably be my bold prediction.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, we saw flashes of it last year, so we'll see what he has in store at St. John's. But with that, we'll wrap things up with St. John's, and we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.